Good stuff. Well, we're gonna end with a band we've talked about quite a bit, but never covered
Yeah.
in album format. We did cover a single. That's Pulp, Different Class from 1995. In the opener, you heard some of Disco 2000, and now you're going to hear a little bit of Sorted for.
Different Class by Pulp comes in at number 39 in the 1990s on Best Ever Albums, number 4 in 1995, number 183 of all time. It's Pulp's highest rated album on Best Ever Albums. It also made Rolling Stone's list, coming in at number 162. And Pulp is ranked number 177 of overall artist rankings on Best Ever Albums.
All right, so boy, what a bio this is, because this is one of the stranger bios we've had along the way. Just so that you know, Pulp can be traced as having started in 1978, and they are still active. So the chronology of this band is they were active from 78 to 2002, 2011 to 13, and 2022 to the present. So this album's 1995. Pulp doesn't even begin to really sniff success in England until the early 90s. Yeah. So there's like a 12-year period where Pulp is in the world, right? Like changing members all the time and like changing sounds. So from a bio perspective, like to condense this all down is hard. But let's just say that like one of the central parts of the band, the central part probably, is Jarvis Cocker, who's the vocalist, the songwriter, a guitarist, and he plays keyboards. And when this album came out, the other members of the band were Russell Sr., who was on guitar and violin, Candida Doyle, who was on keyboards, Mark Webber on guitar and keyboards, Steve Mackey on bass, and Nick Banks on the drums and various percussion instruments. So that's the people that were here. There were lots of other people that have been in the band over the years. So they're there. I'm not going to go into all of them because it would take me like 20 minutes to do that. But let's kind of just give a little bit of a sketch, because I think you kind of have to understand like their origin story to kind of understand like what they are in the 90s. So as I mentioned before, they were formed in 1978 at the City School in Sheffield by the previously named Jarvis Cocker, who's 15 years old. It's a co-educational school, which wasn't always the case in England at that time. The other person he forms it with, who is not in the band by the time this album, Different Class, comes out, is Peter Dalton, who was 14 at the time that they come out. But the band name does surface from the beginning. They're not one of these bands that changes their name a bunch. They named it after the film Pulp, which starred Michael Caine. So that's where the band name comes from to start. However, they do change it shortly after being Pulp to Arabicus, named after a specific coffee bean, before eventually changing it back to Pulp. So they actually start with the name, change it, and then end up with it again. So there haven't been too many of those. They do become Arabicus Pulp, like as a transition back to Pulp. And at this time, you know, Jarvis Cocker's working a variety of like manual labor jobs mixed with some like art type jobs, as with other members of the group, also like living on public assistance for like a lot of the 80s, which is kind of almost impossible for us to think of here in the United States, that like you could sustain like, you could sustain a life as an artist, right? As like a bartender or like a manual laborer, right? But the idea that like for 10 years you could be on the dole doing this, I'm not judging that, but it's just something that just is not the story.
Not possible.
You know,
here.
like when Madonna is slumming it in New York, right? Before she breaks big, she's not like living on welfare. She's, you know, doing a variety of like odd jobs, like hustling, right? Once again, no judgment on that, but it's a very like European story, right? About that. At the beginning, their musical style is described as a cross between ABBA and The Fall, two bands that we covered that I never would have put together in the same package, but you know, that's apparently what the sound was. They're playing live and they're relatively well received. They kind of transition over to a sound that is kind of described as being similar to like what the Human League sounds like around like, you know, that 83, 84 period. They've got new wave and post-punk, and there are some people that start to like make fun of them on the local scene, saying that they sound as if they listen to the John Peel show every night in an endless quest for influences to like mimic, is how they were described as by a particularly snarky fanzine at the time. They kind of like most of the band besides Jarvis Cocker, who kind of always maintains a tie to like the working class, as I don't think is surprising if you listen to the lyrics on all of the songs we've covered. But the rest of the guys went to college and so dropped out a little bit. You know, we've seen that origin story before, but it's been for like, like punk bands, right? It was more like how we came about that a little bit more on like the American side of things. Like, oh, we were young and did it. And then, went to college. So we've seen that, but, they're, as this is going on, they're like making albums. An album they cut in like 1983 is described as being similar to like folkish romantic pop songs that sound like Leonard Cohen. So, so if you're doing a bingo card, right, we've got like ABBA, Human League, Leonard Cohen. A member of the Red Rhino record label at one point talks to Jarvis Cocker, and this is in 1984, so all of this has happened before 84. Remember, this album doesn't come out in 95, and Pulp doesn't really break in England until 92, so this is still 8 years before that happens. They wanted him to kind of make commercial songs like Wham, and this is sort of when Jarvis Cocker decides to like kind of go in a more art rock direction. So more experimental, more artier, noisier kind of, and more pieces. So that is where like, I think the beginning of like what Pulp starts to sound like comes in. During this time, like Jarvis Cocker is like falling out of windows and requiring a wheelchair. They signed another record deal with a group called Fire Records. And they kind of said it was the only offer they got. They're fighting with them all the time. They do an album in 87. They deliver it late. The album's pissed off. Jarvis Cocker kind of says that's the first album where he feels like it's starting to come together for him as a songwriter, but it doesn't in any way like break into the charts in England at all. Once again, the band is like continuing their education. Now some people are in art school and graduate school. So like nothing about Pulp in like 1988, 89 says that this band is ever going to break through. It just seems kind of like they're going to live on like the outside of like musical success. I kind of at this point like saw them as like an even less successful version of like the Meekins, right? Remember that we covered where they're releasing like lots of albums that sound like different things. They have a cult following, but it's just not going to happen to them as like a band that breaks through, right? At this point. Then around 89, the version of the group that starts to become the version that like is on this album pretty much comes together. In 89, it's Cocker, Mackey, Senior, Candida Doyle, and Nick Banks. And there, of course, that's most of the band as it is right now. They do an album. The first side of it is like ballads that they're sort of considered to be like Leonard Cohen type ballads. And the second side is like an acid house infused side, which like at this point they're listening to everything. So they're listening to house music. Jarvis Cocker gets really into Scott Walker and Serge Gainsbourg, two people that we know very well on the show. They're listening to like Magazine at this point and Suicide. And so they're kind of like looking at all kinds of different influences. And they finally release a 12-inch recording in 1991 called My Legendary Girlfriend. And here's where it starts to turn because becomes NME's single of the week. And sort of a recording that they put together called Countdown starts to get mentioned in like more mainstream English press. And so people start to pay attention. They have their first true breakthrough single, a song called Babies, a really good single if you could check it out. That's very much like you start to see like the voice in terms of songwriting for Jarvis Cocker in that song. But they're having trouble like getting a record deal. At this point, finally, they're able to get to Warp Records, and they, in 92, released the album OU. It's the self-titled track OU is a single of the week as well. So now, like people who are in the know on music, there's been enough songs right now that they're starting to get like a band as a buzz. sort of voice. They release Babies, a single, which we talked about before, as well as Razzmatazz, which we covered in the singles. They're both well received, as is another song called Do You Remember the First Time, which hits the UK top 40. And basically all of it comes together into their breakthrough album, His and Hers, in 1994, which in the peak of Britpop, which pushes them along, hits number 9 on the UK album charts and is nominated for the Mercury Music Prize. Pulp is lumped together with Suede, Oasis, and Blur in this Britpop explosion. And then shortly after His and Hers comes out, they put together this album. And the title track, Common People, goes all the way up to number 2 on the UK singles charts. Jarvis Cocker sort of starts to get a reputation as like a thoughtful, like, commentator, I'd say, like kind of like a more gentlemanly, like Morrissey type figure, you know, that very English figure where like they have like an intellectual side, but they're also kind of like slightly crazy, you know, at the same time, that type of like energy. And yeah, I've it's hard to synthesize this bio. I know I've gone in a lot of different directions, but this is kind of considered to be like the peak. They still stay famous throughout the rest of the 90s in England in particular, before sort of stepping away. But this is the year where their album breaks. Common People becomes like a massive single in England. They play at the Glastonbury Festival, where they fill in for the Stone Roses at the last second, and it's super well received. All the critics love this album. And and it kind of leads into a very infamous situation at the Brit Awards where they show up. And this is when like Blur and Oasis are sucking up a lot of the air, right, with their feud. But Pulp kind of steals the scene because Jarvis Cocker enters the stage when Michael Jackson is performing Earth Song and proceeded to wiggle his backside at the audience. And they basically like borderline like escort him out of the building. And when Jarvis Cocker is asked about it, he kind of is unrepentant all the way through, even after Michael Jackson dies. And he just kind of says that like he doesn't appreciate like parts of like what Michael Jackson's like the, you know, the seriousness that he takes his stardom, I guess, is sort of like his take on that. So
okay.
Yeah, so I'm gonna stop there because like there's so much more in this. I mean, they really are a fascinating bio. It's well worth digging into it, guys. If you want to know more, I can maybe color a little bit more as we talk about the album. But I've mentioned a lot of Pulp, you know what I mean, because I'm very familiar with their 90s output. I know you guys have kind of said you're not as familiar with them, so I'm curious to see what you thought. Josh, let's have you start.
Yeah, so this was really the first proper listen to Pulp for me. I had heard Common People before. That's clearly like the most famous song. I don't know if you said this.
Well, there's some other big ones on this one.
Okay, yeah.
Disco 2000, Something Changed, sort of for ease and whiz. Those are all pretty big songs. Yeah,
I really like Disco 2000 too, but I think Common People, I don't know, for me at least, was the only one I was familiar with. So they definitely get like I get the art rock kind of label. They strike me, you didn't mention this in kind of the influences in the bio, but this sounds like the most Bowie-esque to me of all of the big four that we talked about of the Britpop, and like the Bowie influence and kind of the delivery and maybe some of the sound that they're interested in.
Well, and like Pencil Skirt sounds like a Velvet Underground song.
Yeah, well, a Velvet Underground, again, always the perennial influence. But I really liked their sound. It's kind of, a lot of the time it's kind of dancey, but also they're doing really interesting things with the guitars. It's pretty up tempo overall, which I really like. What was the other thing I was going to say? I really like his lyrics. I think he's a really clever writer. There was one line, I didn't write down what song it was, but he said, like, if fashion is your trade, you must be unemployed when you're naked. I thought that was like a really clever line. I think there's lines like that all over the album.
Spoiler alert, there are. I'm going to quote many of them. Yeah.
Right. This was the album I wish I had given more time to this week. The PJ Harvey album was my favorite by far, but I think this one deserved one more listen than I could give it time for. It's interesting too, because they, like you said in the bio, they had such a long kind of road to stardom. Do you feel like that the fact that they were older, at least Jarvis Cocker was older, kind of like influenced their like standing in the community? Like they weren't like, were they, there was so much drama between like Damon Albarn and like Oasis. Do you feel like
they were really popular in England, Josh.
Okay.
I think that's what you got to understand.
Yeah.
Like I think we've mentioned before that like for whatever reason, Oasis was the only of the four Brit rock, unless you count like Song 2 coming over, but I think we've listened to enough Blur already to know that like that's not super representative of like what Blur was. And by the time like Damon Albarn hits in the Gorillaz, that's a whole different style of music.
Right.
I look at it more like, Pulp kind of like lived a shadow life that like people that really knew music knew them, but unless you were in that world, like reading like Spin or stuff here or like getting import magazines, they don't fall out. They're also very British. Like a lot of these stories are like a British spin on things. There's like and I'll get to that in my take, but I think that's part of what was going on as well.
Yeah. I'm not doing a good job of describing kind of like sonically what they sound like on this album, but
they sound like 7 different things on this album, so it's not easy. I'll go into that, but
I overall I like the album. I'm intrigued. I think in terms of
how many times did you listen to it? Because I know time was a little condensed for you this week.
Yeah, just one, to be honest.
Oh, so, then that's gonna be a hard take because there's a lot. Yeah, no, I'm no judgment. I'm just saying it comes across. You know what I mean? Right. Like in that I could see how this would be a hard album to attack just once.
Yep. But what I did in the time I did give it, I am intrigued. I think that I don't know if you guys have now that we've talked about the big four Britpop, I wonder if you have a ranking or if it's changed at all since we've talked about those
I don't feel like I need a ranking because like I that's not how my brain works.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? To like say which one's there. Like I tend to be more that's not like a useful construct for me in terms of, and not in like an arrogant or like dismissive way. It's not kind of how my brain processes these things, if that makes sense. I also think a lot of stuff gets bundled together because it's convenient as opposed to it being truly worth comparing to each other. So
yeah. So you think like the idea of these four bands isn't really like necessarily, I mean, if they didn't cross over to America, how can it really be like Britpop? I don't know.
I feel it's like grunge, where there's some angles of geography and like elements of what they do that are similar, but also they're like very different bands. And it's like kind of like saying rank Soundgarden and Nirvana and Pearl Jam next. They're to me they're very different bands. And I feel that like the influences of Pulp on this album are markedly different than the albums of the influences of like what Oasis is listening to.
Yeah,
like
true.
To me at least. So
yeah, they do. They are. Yeah, I will say all four of those bands are different sounding. I wouldn't say that they're similar in any way, but you're right. I think there's just a convenient geography to associate with this, and there's like a million bands that were also going on besides these four. It's not like they were the only four.
Right.
Anyway, I need to give it more listen. But I am intrigued enough to want to listen to more Pulp too, and so. Yeah, it's a thumbs up for me.
Yeah,
I was thinking of you as we listened to this one this week, Matt. I was curious to see what you think of this one. I have a good idea how you're going to feel about it.
I first want to say that I kind of going off on the Britpop thing. It's now that we've covered all four, this is the first, like you, Josh, this is the first real time I've sat down and listened to a Pulp album.
Yeah.
It's Oasis is just so, it's like if I did the Sesame Street thing, like which one of these things is not like the other, like Oasis definitely stands out as kind of being not like the other because they're just a way more straight ahead rock band, right?
They're less British, right?
They're less British. They're not, they're less quirky, like Blur, Pulp, and Suede are all kind of have quirky kind of things going on, and it's Oasis is none of that. I almost feel like it doesn't make any sense. Like it makes way more sense to compare Nirvana, Soundgarden, Pearl Jam than it does like Oasis to some of these bands. It's kind of interesting. They're British, right? And knowing the more of the sounds of all four of these bands, it totally makes sense that Oasis was the one that break big in the U.S. So to this record, I think the only song I really knew on here was Common People. I think Disco 2000 I was like, okay, that sounds familiar. Like I definitely remember hearing that. That actually, like this time around, I'm like, geez, that's freaking Gloria, like that Gloria. I'm like, did they get? Because I see here it's like all the songwriting credits. I don't see anything from anybody else.
Very
but
similar.
It's a clear ripoff of that, or homage, or however you want to phrase it. But so this record, I think you need to listen to it more than once, Josh. I listened to this several times in the last couple weeks. I feel like I still need to listen to it more. This is it's very good. It's very unique. It's very interesting. It's got a lot. You're right, John. There's a lot. It's drawing from a lot of different places. Certainly Bowie. I saw. I heard Elvis Costello in here. I heard a lot of more modern bands. Like I almost heard more bands. Like the Arctic Monkeys, where I was like, man, they're definitely realistic. That there's parts in that where I'm like, this is really where the Arctic Monkeys are
and his songwriting for sure. Yeah.
And because Arctic Monkeys can do full blown rock out songs, but then they do kind of more of these, like this drawn out ballad that's dramatic. It's a lot of theatrical stuff too,
anthemic.
Anthemic. And there's orchestra arrangements, so it's trying to kind of, Beatlesque, if you will, trying to kind of like incorporate more classical music or more, the variety of different instruments and production styles. And so it's in some ways it was kind of a modern sounding record, because there's, I think, a lot of, bands were kind of trying to, doing similar things to what's happening in this record. I really liked, the string of songs from Common People to I Spy to Disco 2000, Live Bed Show. It's just like boom, boom, boom. Great song. Like really, like I pretty much liked all the songs on here, but those ones in particular really stood out. I thought Feeling Called Love was a really interesting song. I mean, that's where you really get some of the new wave, kind of vibe going on there. That was interesting. I like the last three songs as well, the way that it ends. It's got these soaring vocals and choruses and melodic, music going on, but there's like, this undercurrent of like a quirky British, a vibe, particularly, Jarvis Cocker's vocals are one of those vocals that it's easy to tell they're British. He's not hiding it. Sometimes British artists can hide their British accents, and he's not really doing that here. So I really liked it. It's probably one of the more, I don't know. I feel like this is one of the Blur album that we covered, or the Suede album that we covered. I feel like this one I want even more time with, to truly get it, or to truly like feel the vibes and whatnot. But I also think there's plenty here to keep me interested on one listen. I mean, Common People's just that is just such a banger. Like that's a great song in a club. That's a great song in a car. That's a great song at a wedding. It's got there's a lot of energy here, and a lot of creativity. So thumbs up. These guys are really interesting. I don't know if we're covering another Pulp record, but I would be interested in listening to more for sure.
I am kind of shocked what you guys haven't talked about on this album yet. There's like some things that I am kind of like how you were like, how did you not mention the Sundays, right? When we did the Innocence Mission earlier this album. First of all, like there's a soaring like glam rock energy to this album.
Yeah,
this is like an
definitely.
epic energy. So like when you're saying Bowie, like it's kind of like the Bowie of like the glam rock T-Rex like era, right? And stuff like that. That's one thing that like comes out immediately. Number two, like the mid 2000s of like British rock. Like Pulp is the father of all of that. Like the Kaiser Chiefs and the Fratellis and the Arctic Monkeys. I mean, these are bands that, like, as I was listening to this week, I was laughing. I was like, God, my God, like they, like all of those bands must have just listened to, like, you know, this album and His and Hers like constantly, because like the way that the content of their songs and the way it sound and the epicness, and like you hear a song like Ruby by the Kaiser Chiefs, or like you know, multiple Arctic Monkeys
Yeah,
songs,
I forgot
right?
about the Kaiser
Like
Chiefs.
Monday Morning is a song the Arctic Monkeys could like sing in a second, or you know, like you know, the Fratellis, what's that song, Henrietta? Like they had, like, there's so many songs like that. I'm like, God, my God, this is like directly stuff that lent into that sound. So this is like, if you like that era of like British music, that like 2005 to 08 period of time. Franz Ferdinand a little bit is in this lane, you know, with a little bit of new age in it. So that's there. Also, like, Jarvis Cocker as a songwriter writes just incredibly good songs. They're like literary songs. Like it's funny, like thematically, he writes like really interesting sex songs, like kind of like deviant at times, but also sweet at times. Like you get like a song like Pencil Skirt, which like has borderline like you know, sexual predator vibes to it, but then you also have like this like really vulnerable, like almost sad song like Underwear, right, where it's kind of like you're talking about like the use of sex, but like in the worst possible way that it could be. And then, you know, you get a song like Live Bed Show that's like another like version of like, you know, someone who's like past their prime, you know, and has relied on sex. There's all of these really like interesting takes on, you know, sex. Like we did Razzmatazz before, which was this other like weird. So like it's definitely like there's that lane in his songwriting. But then Common People is this like wonderfully bitter song about like rich people who cosplay as working people, that made me laugh like a lot and was very suitable for where we're at. Like Misshapes is like a geek anthem before that like even is a thing. Disco 2000, yes, it sounds like Gloria. I mean, it's shocking they didn't do it. But lyrically, it's this really like sentimental kind song. And I kind of read about it more, and it's like basically about the first girl Jarvis Cocker ever had a crush on, who was like both nice to him but like unapproachable, and she became like a nerd, like a social worker, I think, and she died young, unfortunately. And like he kind of like always kind of envisioned her as like the perfect woman, and it's called Disco 2000 because like you're trying to imagine like a childhood crush in the moment, but like in the year 2000, and then like you're singing from when 2000's getting close, and you're looking at like where your life's at and like how close it was to you thought what it was. And like, so it's just a beautiful like it like sentiment kind of. And like each of these songs are just like, when we talk about like the Leonard Cohen influence from back in the day, like they don't sound necessarily sonically like Leonard Cohen anymore, but like the quality of the songwriting and the depth of feeling of these songs is something really special. Like Jarvis Cocker is a remarkably good songwriter. And I don't know how much you guys like dug into the lyrics. I know, Matt, you famously are like, it doesn't do much for me. This would be one that I think you'd actually appreciate, like what the lyrics do to the song. And Josh, I know you didn't have as much time as you would have wanted to maybe do it. You did catch some lyrics along the way, but once again, well worth revisiting for that. You know, Sorted for Ease and Whiz, you know, was kind of labeled as a drug song because that's sort of drug language, but he said, no, it's more about like hearing people say it and being like baffled by a scene you're not a part of, you know? I love the eclecticism on this album. It kind of has the breadth and scope that something like Queen does, but to me in a much less schmaltzy way, and in a much more like art rock lane. Right. Of look, it's suitably epic, but it's like it's got a grounding in like the literary Britishness that ties it to like the songwriting of the Kinks, for example, you know, or The Fall, or all these different sort of verbose, you know, English gentlemen, you know, mixed with the neuroticism along the way. So there were a lot of great albums this week. This is the fourth of four that I would give a comfortable, strong thumbs up to. I've always loved this album. I love the album that predates this and follows it as well. I kind of am shocked more people don't know Pulp. Not that they didn't break through in America, but that people who like music didn't like stumble into them, because a lot of these bands broke through into that world in the mid 2000s. And it's kind of like, how can you know about those bands I mentioned and like not know Pulp? Because they so clearly are sonic predecessors to like, what they were doing, that it's just kind of interesting they didn't have like a period of revision. So so I think I might have been higher on this one than you guys were, because this is that PJ Harvey album's like the elitist of the elite. So I can't say it's my favorite of the week, but in most weeks this would have been my favorite album of the week. Yeah.
Nice.
And you kind of have, the lyrics are, you have to listen to them for it to ascend to a certain level, because they really are that good. They're excellent.
Yeah, I definitely got that that feeling. It's and to be clear, I don't normally only listen to albums once. It's just
we're not judging. It's been a week. Yes,
I'm judging you, Josh. Come on,
I
listen to these albums more.
I wanted to give context for the listeners, though, that because you were like, you don't usually struggle to articulate, and like some of it is because you just haven't had as much time with the material this week. So yeah,
for sure. No, I appreciate that. Yeah, it is interesting when they don't the bands that don't get the retrospective like love necessarily that'll when other bands come out and are similar or reference them or something. But I agree, it's and that's one of the reasons why I never listened to them, is like, I guess they just flew under the radar for so long.
Well, that's why we do this damn podcast. There's not going to be much that's going to fly under our radar anymore.
Exactly. Pulp is like proto CTS. That's really what they are.
Yes.
All the references and people they listen to.
Post-proto CTS gaze core. Yes.
Mafioso rap.
Mafioso, yes, there as well.
Psychobilly.
Yes, wave. So speaking of all